Welcome to the Trackpad's Military History Podcast, where we bring the terrain, the tactics, and the stories of soldiers to life. Each episode goes deeper than the written article, giving you a front-row seat to the battles that shaped history. Discover more at trackpads.com.
The opening of this story rests in a dramatic collision of eras, when the familiar thunder of hooves on Europe's fields met the mechanical roar of engines. In August 1914, cavalry still held a central place in the imagination of generals and soldiers alike. Squadrons of Uhlans, hussars, and dragoons moved forward under colorful banners, their lances and sabers glinting in the sun, echoing traditions stretching back to medieval knights and Napoleonic horsemen. But almost immediately, the industrial battlefield revealed itself as an unforgiving enemy to those traditions. Cavalry that once counted on shock, speed, and morale found itself trapped in terrain scarred by trenches, barbed wire, and interlocking machine gun fire. Horses bogged down in mud, riders cut down en masse, and whole formations rendered obsolete in a matter of weeks. What had once been decisive now looked tragically archaic. As the war dragged on, armies searched for a substitute to restore mobility and decisive shock to the battlefield. The solution began to appear in the shape of tanks and armored cars, clumsy in their first outings but promising a restoration of speed and penetration. Unlike horses, these machines did not tire, and their armor offered protection that flesh could not. Still, their engines broke down frequently, and commanders struggled to integrate them into battle plans. The cavalryman, once defined by skill in horsemanship, now faced a cultural transformation, trading reins for gear levers, sabers for radios, and open charges for the confinement of steel compartments. The spirit of the cavalry lived on, but it had to evolve into a mechanized form. This transition was not simply a matter of replacing one tool with another. It was a crucible of leadership, doctrine, and terrain. Some generals, steeped in tradition, resisted the tank as a passing novelty. Others, influenced by thinkers like Fuller, Liddell Hart, and Guderian, saw the possibility of a new battlefield dynamic where armor, speed, and communication could restore the initiative. Terrain shaped this debate in profound ways. Deserts and steppes still offered opportunities for horse-mounted maneuver, while the paved roads and open plains of industrial Europe increasingly favored machines. By the interwar years, it was clear that armies could no longer afford to ignore the steel alternative, though many still clung to the past. For the men who lived through this transformation, the experience was deeply personal. Cavalry troopers who once trusted in their horses, strength now trusted in engines, transmissions, and the teamwork of tank crews. Instead of the exhilaration of galloping under open skies, they fought in cramped compartments filled with heat, fumes, and deafening noise. Death came not from a musket ball or saber slash, but from armor-piercing rounds and sudden fires. Yet the mission remained remarkably consistent: to move faster than the enemy, to strike where least expected, and to shatter cohesion through speed and violence. The passage from horse to track was not the death of shock, but its reinvention, carrying forward the essence of mobility into a new, mechanized age. Cavalry's twilight in the First World War was illuminated first by the brilliance of its traditions, and then by the stark shadows of its decline. At the outbreak of hostilities in 1914, cavalry remained a symbol of national pride and martial prowess. German Uhlans, French cuirassiers, and British dragoons were mobilized with the expectation that they would deliver decisive breakthroughs, scouting ahead of armies and pursuing shattered foes. Their early actions, however, met with grim realities. At battles such as Halen in Belgium, machine guns and rifles devastated charging formations, leaving bodies and horses strewn across the fields. Within months, trenches, barbed wire, and heavy artillery rendered cavalry charges ineffective on the Western Front, forcing mounted troops to dismount and fight as infantry. The dream of decisive mounted shock was withering in the face of modern firepower. Yet the decline was uneven, shaped profoundly by terrain. On the waterlogged plains of Flanders and Picardy, horses floundered in mud, much as armored vehicles would later in the Rasputitsa of Eastern Europe. Endless belts of barbed wire and shell craters created natural barriers that even the most daring riders could not cross. In contrast, the deserts of Sinai and Palestine offered opportunities for mounted mobility. The Australian light horse famously charged at Beersheba in 1917, capturing fortified positions through speed and surprise. Similarly, the wide spaces of the Eastern Front allowed Cossack and Alan units to retain utility, conducting raids and screening movements. Geography dictated where cavalry could survive and where it was doomed, underscoring how environment remained as decisive as any weapon. Cavalry adapted to these pressures by shifting roles. No longer the arm of decision, horsemen increasingly served as screens, reconnaissance elements, or rapid response forces. They guarded flanks, exploited retreats when opportunities arose, and provided valuable mobility in theaters where engines could not yet dominate. But limitations persisted. Horses required vast amounts of fodder and water, tethering operations to supply networks ill-suited for prolonged offensives. Tanks, by contrast, promised to consume only fuel and oil, resources that could be delivered more efficiently along rail lines and depots. The old logistical burden of hay and oats became a glaring vulnerability in a war measured in tonnage and industrial output. Cavalry's endurance was no match for the mechanized future looming on the horizon. Leadership played an important role in this twilight. Some commanders clung stubbornly to the mythology of cavalry's glory, sending their men into futile attacks. Others accepted dismounting as the only path to survival, retraining their troops as mobile infantry. In the British and French armies, units adapted slowly but effectively, learning to fight with rifles and machine guns rather than sabers. German cavalry, however, often remained tethered to outdated notions, wasting lives in fruitless engagements. For the men themselves, morale was shaken by the collapse of tradition. They were heirs to centuries of battlefield prestige, suddenly reduced to roles that felt more auxiliary than decisive. The strain between identity and reality became a psychological battlefield of its own. The arrival of tanks at Cambrai in 1917 announced the final curtain for the horse as a shock weapon. Though mechanically unreliable and tactically underdeveloped, the massed British tanks achieved breakthroughs across wire and trenches that cavalry had failed to cross for years. Cavalry still participated in the exploitation phase, but they were no longer the spearhead. The mantle of battlefield shock had shifted decisively to steel. Soldiers watching those lumbering machines grind forward recognized that the essence of mobility and shock was no longer tied to flesh and muscle. The horse's long reign as the queen of battle had ended, replaced by a new, mechanized order whose potential was only beginning to be understood. The end of the First World War left armies with both scars and questions. And in the 2 decades that followed, the world's militaries became laboratories of doctrine and steel. Britain, which had fielded tanks first, appeared well-placed to lead the mechanized revolution. The creation of the experimental mechanized force in the late 1920s offered a glimpse of what future battle could look like. Tanks, supported by armored cars, motorized infantry, and fast-moving artillery all working in harmony. Visionaries like J.F.C. Fuller and Basil Liddell Hart argued persuasively that tanks should not merely supplement infantry, but serve as the new spearhead of modern warfare. Their writings influenced debate worldwide, but within Britain itself, progress was uneven. Budget cuts imposed by economic austerity, coupled with conservative generals who still believed in the prestige of horse regiments, meant these experiments were often dismantled once the exercises ended. Britain had the ideas but lacked the institutional will to carry them forward. In the Soviet Union, mechanization took on a revolutionary scale that matched the vastness of its geography. Soviet theorists developed the concept of deep battle, envisioning mechanized corps striking across multiple levels of the battlefield simultaneously, tactical, operational, and strategic. Tanks were to be used not in isolated packets, but in overwhelming waves that dislocated entire armies. The adoption of Christie suspension systems allowed their BT-series tanks remarkable speed across rough ground, and Soviet designers carried these innovations into the iconic T-34. Radios were planned to coordinate this new style of war, though shortages often left commanders relying on flags or messengers. For a moment, the Soviets looked poised to outpace the rest of the world in mechanized doctrine. Yet Stalin's purges of the late 1930s decimated the intellectual leadership of the Red Army, gutting its ability to train, command, and innovate just as Europe slid toward war. Ambitious ideas remained, but the human machinery to apply them had been crippled. Ironically, the nation most constrained by the Treaty of Versailles emerged as the leader in mechanized innovation. The German Reichswehr, limited in numbers, poured its energy into doctrine and study. Officers like Heinz Guderian absorbed foreign theories and fused them with uniquely German traditions of Auftragstaktik mission command, based on initiative and tempo. When Hitler cast aside treaty restrictions, this foundation allowed the rapid creation of the Panzerwaffe. German armored divisions were not just collections of tanks but balanced organizations with engineers, artillery, reconnaissance, and logistics working as one. Crucially, radios were made standard, enabling real-time coordination that allowed mechanized shock to maintain momentum after the initial breakthrough. Germany's genius lay not in building the best tank of the time, but in assembling a coherent doctrine that allowed average machines to achieve extraordinary results through speed and concentration. Other nations struggled with their own internal debates. In France, doctrinal disputes between those favoring dispersed armor to support infantry and those advocating concentrated armored divisions produced an uneasy compromise. The result was formations like the Division Cuirassier Reserve, which lacked cohesion and flexibility. While the French army possessed excellent tanks, including heavily armored models like the Char B1, their poor employment rendered them ineffective. Across the Atlantic, the U.S. Army wrestled with how to adapt mechanization without abandoning its cavalry roots. Mechanized cavalry regiments appeared, blending the traditions of reconnaissance with the promise of engines. Yet procurement battles, inter-service rivalries, and the distractions of the Great Depression slowed progress. In many armies, culture and tradition proved as significant as technology in shaping the acceptance or rejection of the tank. Underlying all these doctrinal struggles were the technological realities of the time. Engines grew more powerful, suspensions improved, and transmissions became sturdier, but machines still demanded constant attention. Radios, often fragile and prone to failure, limited communication and coordination. Fuel consumption tied mechanized operations to supply networks that were as critical and vulnerable as any horse herd had been. New support elements emerged: recovery vehicles, maintenance battalions, and supply convoys carrying parts and fuel. Just as cavalry had required blacksmiths and farriers, tanks required mechanics and spare parts. The promise of mechanization was immense, but it came with its own burdens. The armies that recognized the importance of this ecosystem, Germany above all, would carry the advantage when war returned to Europe. The campaigns of 1939 and 1940 put every interwar theory to the test, revealing which doctrines could withstand the crucible of modern combat. In Poland, the popular image of cavalrymen charging tanks with lances became one of history's most enduring myths. The reality was more complex and more tragic. Polish cavalry brigades were highly mobile infantry formations that carried anti-tank rifles and field artillery, fighting mostly on foot. They could still maneuver quickly across broken terrain, but they were fatally outpaced by the operational tempo of the Wehrmacht. German panzer divisions, supported by Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers and combat engineers, bypassed strong points and enveloped defenses at a pace unimaginable to horse-mounted units. The Polish army fought with courage and often inflicted sharp local defeats, but its communications and logistics could not match an enemy that married tanks, radios, and air power into a coherent machine of war. When German armor turned westward in May 1940, the disparity between doctrine and execution became even starker. France fielded more tanks than Germany, many of them technically superior in armor and firepower. Yet French doctrine dispersed them in penny packets to infantry divisions, sapping their ability to concentrate and maneuver. The Germans, by contrast, employed their armor in cohesive divisions, where engineers, artillery, reconnaissance, and signals worked in close harmony. The result was the dramatic Meuse crossings, particularly at Sedan, where Guderian's corps forced a breakthrough. Engineers constructed pontoon bridges under fire, Stukas plastered French defenses, and tanks poured across before commanders on the other side could comprehend what had happened. The tempo of these movements restored the decisive mobility armies had sought since 1914, but now it was achieved with engines and radios rather than horses and sabers. The Allied response at Arras showed both the potential and the shortcomings of their mechanized forces. British Matilda tanks, heavily armored and virtually immune to most German anti-tank weapons, spearheaded a bold counterattack that rattled Rommel's 7th Panzer Division. For a brief moment, German momentum faltered, and panic rippled through command posts. Yet the attack was unsupported, lacking the infantry, artillery, and coordination needed to sustain pressure. Rommel improvised by employing 88mm anti-aircraft guns in a ground roll, tearing into the Matildas and restoring control. The incident underscored a vital lesson. Armor alone was insufficient. Shock came not from tanks in isolation, but from tanks woven into a combined arms fabric where air, engineers, and artillery worked together. Reconnaissance during these campaigns illustrated the transformation of old cavalry roles. German armored cars and motorcycle units swept far ahead of the panzers, probing for weak spots, seizing bridges, and disrupting communications. They carried radios that allowed them to feed back real-time intelligence, a far cry from the days when horse-mounted scouts relied on runners or signals. French mechanized cavalry, while courageous, lacked the same level of integration and often found themselves outflanked or overwhelmed. The essence of reconnaissance, the need to see, screen, and strike first, remained unchanged, but the tempo had accelerated beyond anything horses could achieve. Where once scouts could cover tens of miles in a day, now armored vehicles could cover hundreds, reshaping the scale of operational planning. Perhaps the most decisive factor in these campaigns was leadership. German commanders such as Guderian, Manstein, and Rommel pushed forward relentlessly, often stretching or outright ignoring higher orders to halt. Their willingness to seize opportunities ensured that breakthroughs became collapses, transforming tactical successes into operational victories. French commanders, by contrast, often relied on rigid control, with communication bottlenecks slowing decision-making. Charles de Gaulle attempted counterthrusts with his armored division, demonstrating personal courage and vision, but he lacked support and freedom of action. These contrasts in leadership style amplified the technological gap, proving that machines alone did not win campaigns. It was the fusion of doctrine, technology, and aggressive leadership that brought mechanized shock to life in Poland and France, heralding a new age of war where the horse could no longer compete. The geography of war became the decisive factor in shaping how mechanization could be applied, and nowhere was this clearer than in the deserts of North Africa. The open expanses of sand and scrub provided an arena where tanks could maneuver freely without the barbed wire and trench lines that had strangled movement in Europe during the First World War. British and Commonwealth forces faced Rommel's Africa Corps in a campaign where sweeping armored maneuvers sought to outflank, encircle, and cut off supply lines. Yet the desert was as cruel a master as it was a battlefield. Fuel, water, and spare parts dictated the pace of every thrust, and a force that advanced too far without securing its lifeline risked destruction. Rommel mastered the art of deception and ambush, employing the 88mm gun to devastating effect against overconfident British armor. Ultimately, victory in the desert went to the side that mastered both maneuver and logistics, a reminder that mechanization brought new strengths but also new dependencies. The Eastern Front presented the opposite extreme terrain so vast and conditions so punishing that even modern machines struggled. The Rasputitsa, the infamous mud seasons of spring and autumn, turned roads into seas of sludge, where even the most advanced tanks became immobilized. German panzers that had sliced through Poland and France found themselves bogged down, their operational tempo shattered. Soviet forces, however, turned the terrain to their advantage. The T-34 tank, with its wide tracks and sloped armor, was designed for these conditions, giving it an edge over its German counterparts. Cavalry mechanized groups emerged as innovative formations, combining horse-mounted troops who could traverse mud and snow with armored elements that delivered shock when conditions permitted. In the depths of winter, when machines froze solid and engines refused to turn over, horses once again became indispensable, hauling supplies and guns where fuel trucks could not pass. The Eastern Front proved that mechanization had not fully banished the horse, but instead forced it into new roles alongside steel. In Western Europe, terrain once again dictated adaptation. The Bocage country of Normandy in 1944 was a nightmare for armored warfare. Dense hedgerows with earthen banks and tangled vegetation turned every field into a fortress. Tanks advancing down narrow lanes became easy prey for German infantry, armed with Panzerfausts and concealed machine guns. American forces responded with ingenuity, welding steel prongs to their Sherman tanks to create rhinos capable of plowing through the hedgerows. Still, success required painstaking cooperation between tanks, infantry, and artillery. Armor could no longer surge ahead. It had to grind forward in intimate partnership with dismounted troops. Similarly, urban warfare from Stalingrad to Aachen demanded close integration, with engineers clearing obstacles, infantry rooting out ambushers, and tanks providing firepower at street level. Terrain was never neutral. It dictated tempo, shaped tactics, and constantly redefined what mechanized shock could achieve. Rivers and waterways created another persistent obstacle for mechanized armies. Where cavalry might once ford shallow streams or hastily throw together bridges, mechanized forces required complex engineering efforts. Pontoon bridges, smoke screens, and synchronized artillery fire became the hallmarks of river crossings. At the Vistula in 1944, Soviet armies coordinated engineers, artillery barrages, and air power to push tanks across under withering fire, creating the momentum that would eventually carry them to Berlin. For defenders, demolitions and fortified crossings offered delaying tactics that could buy critical time. River operations underscored that mechanization demanded new kinds of specialized units, from bridging battalions to recovery crews, transforming the very structure of armies. The mountainous campaigns of Italy and the Balkans exposed the limits of mechanization more clearly than perhaps any other theater. Narrow roads twisted up steep slopes, bridges collapsed under the weight of armor, and tanks that managed to climb often found themselves funneled into killing zones. Here, the mule train returned as the indispensable logistic solution, carrying supplies where engines could not. Tanks still had a role, providing direct fire support or breaking through in valleys, but the notion of massed armored thrusts evaporated in rugged terrain. The lessons were stark. No machine, however advanced, could escape the dictates of geography. Just as cavalry had once found itself constrained by mud, forests, and mountains, so too did mechanized forces learn that terrain remained the ultimate arbiter of tactics. The men who climbed into steel machines carried with them the soul of the cavalry, reshaped for a new age. Regiments that had once prided themselves on horsemanship now draped their traditions over tanks and armored cars. Crests, banners, and battle honors were transferred wholesale to armored brigades, preserving a sense of lineage even as horses vanished from the ranks. Soldiers continued to name their machines as they once named mounts, painting emblems on armor plates, building bonds of identity and pride. What had once been expressed in the elegance of the saddle and the cut of a uniform was now found in the rumble of engines and the discipline of gunnery. The culture of shock did not die with the horse. It adapted, carrying regimental spirit into the age of steel. Training in mechanized units demanded a discipline as rigorous as any cavalry school, but entirely different in form. Instead of mastering the seat and saber, crews drilled in coordination, gunnery, and communication. The commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator formed a team whose survival depended on flawless execution. Radios, fragile but essential, became lifelines that tied platoons together in ways horsemen had never experienced. Maintenance became as routine and necessary as grooming once had been for cavalry. Checking engines, tightening tracks, and cleaning weapons consumed hours each day. Non-commissioned officers emerged as the backbone, ensuring that tanks could roll at dawn just as cavalry sergeants once ensured horses were fed, shoed, and ready. In this way, a new martial skill set replaced the old, but the demand for discipline and constant readiness remained. Life inside the tank imposed hardships that cavalrymen never knew. Crews operated in stifling heat, with deafening noise and choking fumes filling cramped compartments. Unlike a horseman exposed to the open air, the tanker lived in a steel cage, reliant on machinery for both movement and survival. Fear took new forms. A cavalryman might face the risk of musket or shell fire, but a tanker dreaded armor-piercing rounds that could ignite a catastrophic fire inside the compartment. Survivors carried scars from watching comrades trapped in burning hulks, memories that haunted long after the battle. Yet these conditions also created bonds of remarkable strength. Crew members trusted one another implicitly, their lives bound together by the roles they played and the trust that each would perform his duty under pressure. Despite the rise of machines, the horse never disappeared entirely from the Second World War. German supply lines remained heavily dependent on horse-drawn wagons, particularly on the Eastern Front, where roads collapsed under weather and overuse. Soviet cavalry, operating alongside mechanized units, conducted daring raids deep behind German lines, exploiting terrain where tanks faltered. The Italian Savoia Cavalleria famously charged Soviet positions at Izbeshensky in 1942, reminding the world that under rare circumstances, mounted shock still had its place. Horses persisted not as the main weapon of decision, but as a crucial support, a reminder that modernization was never absolute. War was too vast and terrain too varied for any single form of mobility to dominate completely. By the war's end, the legacy of cavalry's ethos lived on in the very formations that had replaced it. Reconnaissance units carried forward the spirit of aggressive scouting, now with armored cars and light tanks instead of horses. Regiments that once bore sabers now prided themselves on radio discipline, rapid maneuver, and precision fire. The cavalryman's drive to be first into contact, to see the enemy before the enemy saw him, survived in steel. What was lost in the romance of the charge was gained in the coordination of machines, crews, and combined arms. The culture had evolved, but the spirit endured, ensuring that the shock and dash of cavalry would never truly vanish from modern armies. Even after the Second World War ended, the story of shock and mobility did not stop with the rumble of tank treads. In many regions, horses lingered in roles that machines could not yet fully replace. Eastern Europe, China, and even parts of post-war Germany relied on horse-drawn wagons to carry supplies through ruined infrastructure. In Asia, cavalry units continued to patrol remote areas where vehicles could not travel, proving that the animals still had utility in the aftermath of the world's most mechanized conflict. But while horses lingered in logistics and local security, the mantle of shock and maneuver clearly belonged to steel, and increasingly, to flight. The spirit of cavalry found its new expression in vehicles that could leap over terrain in ways horsemen once dreamed of. The emergence of helicopters in the mid-20th century gave rise to the concept of air cavalry. In Korea and later in Vietnam, helicopters brought mobility to landscapes where armor could not dominate. Gunships and troop carriers moved forces rapidly over jungle and mountain, delivering shock and surprise from above. Soldiers trained in these new formations adopted the language and ethos of cavalry, with units like the 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, explicitly carrying forward the traditions of mounted maneuver. What once relied on hooves and then on tracks now relied on rotors, but the principles of speed, initiative, and sudden concentration remained the same. In many ways, air cavalry reconnected with the cavalry ideal of bypassing obstacles and striking where the enemy was least prepared. Meanwhile, armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles reshaped ground combat by blending the strengths of infantry with mechanized mobility. Armies realized that tanks alone could not dominate complex terrain without close infantry support. Vehicles like the American M113 or the Soviet BMP allowed troops to ride into battle protected, dismount under fire, and continue alongside tanks. This integration created a new rhythm of combined arms, where the distinction between cavalry, infantry, and armor blurred. Mechanization was no longer limited to breakthrough forces. It became the everyday face of the modern army. The cavalry tradition of operating as mobile, aggressive, multi-role units lived on in mechanized infantry battalions, combining protection, firepower, and speed in ways their mounted predecessors would have instantly recognized. As the Cold War deepened, technology pushed the cavalry spirit into the realm of long-range precision. Reconnaissance strike complexes emerged, integrating satellites, sensors, and long-range fires to achieve what cavalry scouts had once done with eyesight and speed. Instead of galloping patrols or armored cars, drones and surveillance aircraft now identified enemy concentrations. Instead of sabers or lances, mechanized armies wielded missiles and air-delivered munitions to deliver decisive shock at a distance. Yet the principle was unchanged: to find first, strike first, and keep the enemy off balance. Doctrine like maneuver warfare in NATO and deep battle concepts in the Soviet Union showed the continuity of thought, even as the tools became almost unrecognizable to the horsemen of 1914. Cultural traditions proved just as enduring as doctrinal ones. Many armored and reconnaissance regiments proudly preserved cavalry names, insignia, and rituals, even as their mounts became machines. The regimental colors carried forward honors earned in the age of the horse, creating a bridge between past and present. Soldiers still spoke of dash, initiative, and esprit de corps, qualities prized in cavalrymen for centuries. Whether in tanks, helicopters, or infantry fighting vehicles, they carried the same ethos: to move fast, hit hard, and embody the shock that could unravel an enemy's plans. In this way, the cavalry never truly disappeared. It simply shed its skin, evolving into new forms, suited to a new age of technology and war. The journey from horse to track, and later to rotor and missile, was not a clean rupture, but a long transition where old and new overlapped in unpredictable ways. In 1914, cavalry was still imagined as the decisive arm of war, yet by 1918 its role had been hollowed out by trenches, barbed wire, and machine guns. Tanks, fragile and few, showed glimpses of a new form of shock, one that could break the stalemate and restore mobility. Over the next 2 decades, armies wrestled with doctrine, technology, and culture, unsure how to reconcile centuries of cavalry tradition with the untested promise of mechanization. The crucible of 1939 and 1940 provided the answer. Those who mastered the orchestration of tanks, radios, engineers, and aircraft would dictate the shape of modern conflict. Terrain remained the great constant across this story, a reminder that no weapon could escape the geography of war. In deserts, tanks maneuvered freely but lived or died by supply. On the steppes, mud and snow humbled even the mightiest machines, while the bocage and cities of Western Europe forced armor into intimate cooperation with infantry. Rivers and mountains demanded engineering ingenuity as much as raw firepower. These landscapes echoed the challenges cavalry had faced in earlier centuries, proving that while technology evolves, the battlefield always imposes its own rules. Armies that understood this truth endured. Those that ignored it paid in blood and defeat. For the soldiers themselves, the passage from hoof to track was as personal as it was strategic. Cavalrymen who had once defined their lives by horsemanship now learned to trust machines, radios, and engines. Tank crews lived in conditions more confined and terrifying than any cavalry troop could have imagined, yet they also shared bonds of trust as deep as those between rider and mount. Horses lingered in logistics, in rare charges, and in memory, but the age of mechanized shock had begun. The essence of cavalry, the will to move fast, strike suddenly, and collapse the enemy's cohesion, survived intact, only expressed through different tools. The legacy of this transformation remains visible today. Modern mechanized forces, from main battle tanks to helicopter assault units and drone reconnaissance, all trace their lineage to both the horse and the early tank. The thunder of hooves has become the roar of engines, the whine of rotors, and the buzz of drones, but the underlying principle has not changed. Shock, speed, and decisive maneuver remain at the heart of military thought. The cavalry did not vanish. It evolved, carrying its spirit forward into every age of war. From horse to track and beyond, the quest for decisive mobility continues to define how armies fight, reminding us that while tools change, the human drive to outpace and outmaneuver the enemy is eternal.
Thank you for joining us on the TrackPad's Military History Podcast. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the battlefield, be sure to explore more articles, episodes, and series at trackpads.com.